I think the root cause of why so many businesses, specifically financial services companies, struggle with risk management is having the wrong process taxonomy. So invest in getting the right process taxonomy, and that has to have a complete and accurate representation of everything you do so that you have a complete and accurate representation of your business context when assessing your risk environment and defining controls.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our interview with Michael Shank. Michael is a founder and managing director at Process Inventory Advisers LLC, and he has over 25 years of experience as a management consultant in the financial services industry, advising clients on technology risks, processes, and digital transformation. His new book, Digital Transformation Success, is published just by the end of last year, and it shares how to drive a new level of operating efficiency and agility necessary to thrive in this digital era. So, Michael, welcome to our Risk Management Show podcast today.
Boris, I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure as well. So you recently had an interview with our colleague in another format. We had a format of a risk management chat. You had a topic, you discovered topic of enhancing enterprise risk management through process capability. And today we will expand this topic and discuss the power of a business integrated risk management approach.
Yes.
All right. But before that, Michael, could you remind us, or maybe tell so people who didn't participate in the first episode, didn't watch or didn't listen, about a short story about yourself, your career path, and what you're up to these days?
For sure. So I spent most of my career, as you mentioned, in consulting. So the first 13 years at Accenture, where I was very technology focused. So it was a Java, C++ programmer. I was a solution architect. I led large system development programs. Spent a couple of years at Bank of America in that same technology capacity. Then I moved to Ernst & Young, and they didn't really have a large technology capability at that point. But one of the first projects I did was a large bank and wanted us to create a business capability model. So we interviewed some of the business and created, everything that bank did on a single sheet, but then it went a couple levels deep. And I just immediately, it was an epiphany moment. I'm like, wow, this just seems so powerful. And coming from a technology background, I did not know what the business did. My focus was on, is the code work? Is it on time? Is it defect free relatively? But now this kind of opened my eyes to, wow, I could see everything that this bank did. So when I was at EY, I kind of dedicated myself to this topic. So started with kind of built a business architecture practice, but then it evolved as I interacted with various clients, and it turned into a process excellence group that I ran there. And when I did that, I kept applying it to different topics, from defining a strategy, doing a transformation program, designing technology, and risk management. And when I give a lot of talks, I always talk about, the common failure for transformations is complexity or chaos. And I've come across chaos a lot in my career of, strategies not being clear to the teams, and they're siloed organizations that can't work together, and plans don't make sense. And I've had a lot of clients that are respected that got lost their jobs or got removed from certain positions because they fell victim to it. So I've dedicated a lot of my time in that space to testing out and really detailing out this framework as an antidote to that chaos. So I went to Citi after that for two years, and I was head of process excellence for their U.S. retail bank. And then I wanted to write this book, so I left in March of 23 to write it. And as you mentioned, it published in December, and I've been building a consulting business, and I'll be rolling out training as well, just educating people on what this framework does and how it could power your transformation.
Fantastic. So, of course, we know that traditional ERM programs have made strides, but they often fall short due to blind spots or data quality issues, confusion in the operating models, and lack of precise business context. Let's discuss how we can address these shortcomings, ensuring better risk management, compliance, and strategic decision makers. So,
Yep.
Michael, from your experience in risk management, why do risk management program fail?
So if I'm going to summarize it in kind of a very succinct way, it's lack of concise business context. So, and I'll go further. It's your process taxonomy. So what organizations lack is a model of what their business does. Because if you think about a GRC platform, really it does many things, but one of them is it manages your risk data. And then that data model, there's always kind of a chain of what is my processes, what are the risks on my processes, what are the controls on my risks, and what are monitors that I have to have on those controls. Well, that process part is the anchor of that data model. But what organizations get wrong is they use a generic taxonomy, like an APQC process classification framework, which for those that don't know, it's a generic taxonomy that covers what an organization can do. But a lot of the organizations that have an ERM program are much more complex than that. And I worked at one big bank, and they used similar kind of generic framework, but they had a mortgage business that did way different processes than their retail business, which had very different processes in their credit card business and their wealth and their institutional banking, et cetera. Now, when you use a generic platform and you do risk assessments at each of those business levels, there's a lot of interpretation. So, okay, my business doesn't really do what this process taxonomy says, so I'm going to interpret what I do here to be this and what I do there to be this, et cetera. So that means that the risk data in GRCs is typically incredibly flawed, lacks accountability, and I've seen it over and over again where then the data's poor that you're reporting out to senior management and to regulations or to the external regulators of that. And coming from the banking industry, which is one of the most heavily regulated industries, I've seen a ton of MRAs and consent orders and a lot of challenges just because these businesses just can't get it right. And I think the core issue is that process taxonomy.
All right, very interesting. So can you tell us in ballpark, what is the process inventory framework?
That's a great question. So the goal of the process inventory is to capture every single process that your organization does. As I mentioned, there's kind of two prevailing thoughts now and how the process architecture is created, and that's APQC, so use a generic framework, or core. We'll just capture our core processes, the customer facing, et cetera, and that's how we'll do risk management. Well, I think that's wrong because it always leads to the data gaps. So I want to capture in my framework every single process that happens in the organization. How do you do that? You have to anchor to something that's complete, which is your organizational hierarchy. So creating the process inventory it's an interview process, and you start at the top of the hierarchy and you just ask a simple question. What is it that you do? And you take those responses and you turn it into verb, noun, process names. But you keep walking that, yes, their team's what they do. Yes, their team's what they do, until you get to a level that you feel like you've captured the right level of process details. And then I do attestations going up so that everyone and I do formal attestations of email or workflow or whatnot, but I get everyone to say, yes, this is accurate and complete. So now I could base my risk assessments and my risk data off of it. There's one other aspect of it, which is data integration. So there is a lot of operational data that's in everyone's environment. So from application repositories, vendor catalogs, HR systems for people and teams. Well, if you could take all that data now and integrate it in kind of migrate it to a process tool, now I could take those data elements and associate it with the right process. And what I'm creating is a single comprehensive repository of all operational intelligence that connects the dots across. Now, what are my processes? Where is my technology used? Where's my third party vendors? What do they do for me, et cetera, which is going to be incredibly useful for a lot of risk management, because ultimately we live in a very interconnected and interdependent world, and we have to understand what are those connection points, because any element within this kind of this ontology of how our operations run can be a source of risk that can be fatal if not mitigated appropriately.
Awesome. So what is the major causes of this risk data quality issues, and how can this process framework taxonomy solve this quality issue, data quality issue?
Yeah, it comes down to ultimately you need a ground truth of business context. So and I tell this story too, like if you look at like something like Google Maps is a massive data integration effort because they have satellite imagery, they have on street level imagery, they have restaurant ratings, they have traffic information, et cetera. But they all have to anchor back to what is their ground truth. And their ground truth obviously is the physical environment. Everything has to resolve to the physical environment. Well, when you're doing a massive data integration to understand all these connection points, businesses need that ground truth, and that ground truth has to be your process inventory or a complete representation of what your business does, or the complete context. So if you have that, now when you do your risk assessments, you're a lot more structured and more systematic in how you do it, because now the first line of defense team, if your organization has a 3 lines of defense model, the first line and the second line can coordinate because they're looking at the same ground truth of what the business does, and they could look at in each individual process and say, what are we doing in that process? Is there risk? Is it an acceptable level? Do we need to design controls around it? So it really gets all the stakeholders on the same page and into that ground truth. That's going to clean up your data. That's going to clean up your operating model. And I saw one survey that said that 50% of respondents said that they had challenges in defining roles and responsibilities across their first line and second line of defense. And I've seen that in my personal experiences working with a lot of these big banks. I'd say there's another aspect of it too, which is the internal audit. I've come across a lot of internal audit teams that do process mapping, which is kind of crazy to me because that's not their role. Their role should be to test controls and make sure they're effective.
Mhm.
But they end up doing process maps because they don't understand what the business does. They just, their expertise is testing controls. So they're forced to create these maps because they just have no visibility, and they have to do that. This framework gives them the transparency they need so that they can focus on the right thing.
So this kind of reduces chaos in the operation environment, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Okay. Okay. So, what type of risks kind of influenced by this model? Is it only operational risk or other third-party risk, or can we just do it like silos, or is it comprehensive risk approach?
I think that you brought up silos, which I think is a great thing to key off of. I've seen some organizations that have different views of what the business does. So maybe your operational resiliency is attached to business services, or your resilience is attached to some other taxonomy of what the business does. And it's just um, exasperates the confusion, because now you have teams that have different views of the world. But if you could join those all to the same view of the world, and let's take each, and then now you have a much more integrated and cohesive approach that makes everything much more efficient in how you use those teams and those resources. But let's take each one by one. So operational risk is really the risk of what you do day to day. Is, as you serve your customers, as you create value, are you doing things that create risk for the organization, that create risk for your customers and even the market, and capturing those and analyzing and making sure that you're measuring those appropriately and prioritizing those appropriately for controls. Compliance risk. Compliance risk is all about, are you complying with laws, regulations, standards, et cetera? Now, I look at it as just kind of a data mapping thing, because there's a finite amount of laws and regulations. And with AI, you could do horizon scans to understand what those regs are. But then an organization has to interpret those and create regulatory obligations, which means, what does it mean for me, and what's my obligation to these? Well, if you have a full index of full taxonomy of your processes, now you could do a mapping of those obligations to your processes. And as you do those mappings, now you're very clear as to where those regulations are. And now the first and second line teams and the technology and all other stakeholders involved can design the appropriate controls so that you could say, yes, I'm complying with these regulations. And then you could use this as a vehicle to communicate with your external regulators of here's my interpretation, here's where I'm complying, et cetera. I think it really could smooth that whole interaction out. Third-party vendor risk management, which is a big thing. There's been a lot of instances where there's data breaches where the third-party vendor just didn't have the right data protections and controls. Well, when you use a third-party vendor to do, maybe you outsource your certain business processes to them, you have to realize that your organization is still accountable for it. So you need to have precise knowledge of what vendors you have, what processes they're integrated with, so that you could look at it and say, okay, what controls are they responsible for? So if they're handling, say, PII data like social security number, et cetera, like, do they have the right data protections in place to make sure that I'm not going to be exposed from some data leak that maybe they're not accompanied by? So having this connection of what is all my processes and where all the vendors and where they work, like, it's incredibly useful for the third-party vendor risk management. Operational resiliency, the last one. And the regulators are starting to ramp up their expectations for what organizations need to do. In Europe, you have DORA, Digital Operational Resiliency Act, which is mandating that all financial institutions be compliant by January 2025. There's a lot of other ones, but essentially what those regulations mandate is that you need to understand where you use technology, where you use third-party vendors, and you have to have a view of everything your business does, and you have to have your business partners that come in and say, these are my critical business processes or critical functions. And that, in the event of an adverse event, like a natural disaster or like a hurricane or some other like COVID or whatever, that you define what the minimum level of operations for those processes are, and that you look at how technology is used and is it resilient? Am I geographically diverse in my data centers or whatever? And that you build the right processes in place when that event occurs. Well, that's just a huge data mapping issue, and you need to understand where all these connection points are. And most organizations just don't do that. So I see a lot of organizations that struggle with that and struggle with their resiliency programs. And I think this is the solution to handling that.
Fantastic. So it's a very comprehensive structure. So I would like to ask you, Michael, your personal point of view. What is the major misconception in this field of ARM and process mapping and what you do that you kind of strongly disagree with?
Yeah, I think well, besides the APQC and the generic one, I think that organizations don't realize that you've got to put not the hard work, but you've got to put the work in to understand everything that your organization does. And I think in my experiences, a lot of people don't necessarily view process as important. They'll say it's important, but organizations aren't investing in building a process capability that will get you there. So my big message is, I think the root cause of risk challenges is having the wrong process taxonomy. But in order to get that, leadership and the whole organization needs to see how important it is, and they need to make the investment and make the commitment to building this in a sustainable way. And one of the things that I describe in my book and I describe in other forums as well is, if you're going to go down this path, you create a process taxonomy, your organization is changing constantly. So you've got to do governance to make sure that this taxonomy maintains accuracy and comprehension over time. So you have to build a process capability, which I sometimes call a process center of excellence, that has governance routines. So, and that's one of them is you've got to go back out to the business on a periodic basis, 6 months, a year, whatever you think is right, and ask the business, is this part of the taxonomy still accurate and complete, and get attestations. But I think there's another way, and that's, if you embed this process taxonomy in all ways of working that an organization does, not only just risk, but everything else, operations, from how they drive change and how they define strategy and how they design their technology environment. Now you have all the stakeholders in the environment that have a vested interest in this being accurate, and that can lead to almost real time updates as things change. So it's very important that the misconception that people get that this is a critical enabler and that they've got to invest the time and the effort.
All right. So let's drill a little bit deeper. For example, if we take life of average risk manager, if there is one thing they should start to prioritize right now that they are not doing currently, what would it be?
Well, I think it's follow this this process path, build the process taxonomy, and get more structure around how you do risk assessment. So risk assessments can happen on a yearly basis or whatever the periodicity is, but they should look at, okay, if you take down your organizational structure, it's ultimately you've got denominators. You've got so many number of units, so many number of processes. Well, if you could anchor your assessment to it and say, okay, I have 100 processes in this business unit, let's say just for round numbers. Now I can ensure when I do my risk assessment, I'm looking at each and every process from a operational risk, a compliance risk, third-party vendor risk management, resiliency, and all the other ones, financial risk, et cetera, and making sure that you have that level of systemic approach to ensure that you've completely looked at everything, and that you are accurate and complete in those assessments, so that when you roll that data up to executive leadership, now they could have confidence in what they're seeing so that they could base their strategic decisions on. So it's all about morphing kind of your risk methodology to leverage this as a strategic asset.
All right, fantastic. So, Michael, if we summarize our interview for someone who is listening and who would like to walk away with one or two major takeaways, what would it be?
I think, I'll just hit this point again. I think the root cause of why so many businesses, specifically financial services companies, struggle with risk management is having the wrong process taxonomy. So invest in getting the right process taxonomy, and that has to have a complete and accurate representation of everything you do, so that you have a complete and accurate representation of your business context when assessing your risk environment and defining controls.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much for all your very thoughtful interview. If I forgot something, that's why all my questions. If I forgot to ask you something that you feel is very important to our audience, please go ahead.
And yeah, I'll just say this, and I'll take it outside of risk management for a second. I think this structure and a lot of why I wrote the book, because I think transformations fail because of lack of alignment. There is a lot of different perspectives from business and risk and technology and data, and we need to get our organizations into alignment so that from the top of the house to lower level contributors and across different functional groups, everyone knows precisely what they're supposed to do in driving transformational change. So this framework not only does operational risk, but as I mentioned, it can help you drive your change process. It can help you streamline your operations and cost and use of resources. It could do really everything that you need to run your business and to transform your business, all through a single common lens of what the business does. And to me, it's incredibly powerful, and that's why I wrote the book, and that's why I'm building a business, because I'm incredibly passionate that this is the answer.
Fantastic. Yeah, we'll see the book on the background, and we will also put a link in our show notes to your book for listeners or viewers to click and buy if they want.
Perfect.
All right, Michael, thank you very much again, and I wish you a great success with your career and your consultancy, both in educational and also business-wise.
Perfect. Thank you, Boris. This has been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye-bye.